In 2330, 4 families of colonists were under siege by spacers. Cut off from each other and the outside world by a communications blackout, things were looking grim until help arrived from an unlikely source. I'm the Irresolute Cartographer, and this is the story of the formation of a family defense pact and their battle to secure their home. Before we get into this, I need to note one particularly important thing. The location of the mission upon which this lore is based, failure to communicate, is somewhat random. I'll talk more about this at the end of the video, but hopefully this will suffice to explain why some shots will be set in the Tau Ceti system and some in the Andromeda system. For the purpose of telling this story, I'm going to use the locations as I encountered them in the Tau Ceti system. With that said, let's get started. When humanity left the Sol system in the mid-22nd century, our colonization efforts were combined in a force known as the United Colonies. Thanks to the Centaurus Proclamation of 2161, independent groups began to form and spread across the stars. Though, over a century and a half later, the people of the settled systems have generally distributed themselves into the large established factions, there are those who desire true freedom and independence. These families, or groups of families, work with a League of Independent Settlers, or LIST. LIST provides prospective colonists with a ship, supplies, information, and a destination in which to settle. As LIST isn't the wealthiest organization out there, the ships they provide are usually on their last legs. Assuming that the colonists do arrive at their intended destinations, they still face myriad issues attempting to establish themselves. If they persevere through these difficulties, they emerge as their own tiny independent faction, free to govern themselves as they please. One such colony LIST organized in the Tau Ceti system belonged to the Lopez family. Established as a farming colony on Tau Ceti 2A, the Lopez farm was the first outpost in the system. It wasn't long after the Lopez organization got off the ground that 3 other LIST-sponsored families followed them to Tau Ceti. The Winds organized a farming outpost on Tau Ceti 8D, the Bandas built their own farm near Tau Ceti 9, and the Lemaires established a mining operation on Tau Ceti 1. Albin Lopez, the head of the Lopez family, was infuriated by the arrival of these newcomers. As his family had been the first to settle the system, he had considered it to be their territory. His response to the unwelcome outsiders was to run cons on them. Though he wronged all the other LIST colonies, he especially went after the Lemaires, as their mining operations were proving to be the most successful enterprise in the system. Starting with simple slights, missed deadlines, and the theft of a shipment of ore here and there, Albin's antics got so bad that on one occasion he nearly killed the Lemaire family. It was after this incident that the fledgling colonial community collapsed, and the families began to avoid one another. This might not have been a problem, but for the formation of a dangerous spacer band that put the 4 families in their crosshairs. Unlike the unaligned but productive colonists of LIST, spacers are unaligned murdering thieves. Usually present only in small numbers and amounting to no more than a nuisance, they have at times united into war bands that can pose a serious threat. In 2330, just such a band of spacers formed in the Tau Ceti system and began to attempt to seize the system. Seeing any cooperation between the LIST families as a potential threat, the spacers began to disrupt their communications. In attacking their LIST-provided comms satellites, the spacers isolated the families such that no counterattack could be properly coordinated. Nor could the families call for help from outside the system. Though Albin Lopez attempted to repair his family's satellite twice, on both occasions he was chased off by spacers lying in wait. With the future looking grim, Albin began to broadcast a general appeal for assistance as far as his equipment could reach without extraplanetary assistance. Luckily for Albin and his neighbors, his call for help worked. Having arrived in the Tau Ceti system on a surveying mission, the constellation ship Frontier had entered the range of Albin's broadcast. Hearing his call for help, the captain of the Frontier laid in a course for the Lopez farm. Seeing this unknown ship landing at his farm, Albin came out armed and ready to fight the spacers he assumed had arrived to wipe his family out once and for all. When he realized that his calls for help had been answered, he was shocked. He explained the situation in the system as best he could, and asked the captain for help in the fight against the spacers. When the captain agreed to help, Albin explained his plan of action, starting with the restoration of his family's satellite so that he could coordinate with the captain across the system. Once that was complete, he would provide the locations of the other 3 families' satellites, which, when repaired, would allow them to work together against the spacer threat. With the plan agreed to, the Frontier took off, and in a few moments, the ship was back in orbit above the moon. The damaged Lopez satellite hung in geosynchronous orbit above their outpost, so just in taking off, the Frontier was already in the right place. The satellite remained a trap, but unfortunately for the spacers guarding it, the Frontier wasn't a simple colonial maintenance craft. After a quick battle, the spacer ships were turned into space junk, and the Frontier was able to make the necessary repairs to the satellite. With communications with the Lopez family restored, Albin provided the coordinates of the list satellites belonging to the other families, and the Frontier set a course for each. In orbit above Tau Ceti 9, another squad of spacer ships again confronted the Frontier, and just as before, the Frontier defeated all three. With the local threat defeated, the Frontier repaired the satellite belonging to the Banda family, restoring communications between the Banda and Lopez families. Albin Lopez told Chanda Banda, the head of the Bandas, that the four families needed to meet. Chanda agreed, but thanks to Albin's past wrongdoings, he didn't think the Lemaire's would go for it. With that, the Frontier departed for the Wynn family satellite in orbit above Tau Ceti 8D. Upon arrival, they found the satellite suspiciously unguarded. When the Frontier made its repairs, Albin attempted to make contact, only to discover that the Wynn family was gone. They were likely dead, massacred by the spacers. This had been the fate waiting for each of the families had Constellation not intervened. The Frontier left the moon and the lost colony behind and headed for Tau Ceti 1. Once again, the Frontier was greeted by an unguarded satellite. Though this may have prompted fears of another destroyed family, a spacer surprise attack allayed these concerns. Having blasted the spacer ships into space junk, the Frontier went to work on the last satellite. With the Lemaire satellite repaired, Albin Lopez called to Jacqueline Lemaire and attempted to organize a meeting between the remaining families. Though she was happy to have her satellite operational again, Jacqueline immediately assumed that Albin was attempting to run another con on her. In the end, she agreed to meet, provided that the meeting took place aboard her ship. Albin invited the captain of the Frontier to the meeting, promising payment and potentially more work. The Frontier headed for Jacqueline Lemaire's ship and found it guarded by ships belonging to the Lopez and Banda families. Soon, the captain was on board where they found the three heads of the remaining families already in conversation. Albin revealed the sad fate of the Wynn family, eliciting shock from his neighbors. When he attempted to point out that it was their disunity that had allowed the Wynns to be picked off, Jacqueline Lemaire was quick to remind him that it was his actions that had caused that problem in the first place. Luckily for Albin, Chanda Banda was on his side and agreed that despite all that the Lopez family had done in the past, the spacers were a very real existential threat to their families. Albin proposed a solution to the attackers, a defense pact. The three families would combine their ships, men, and materials into one force to fight the spacers. Jacqueline wasn't on board with his idea. Albin Lopez was practically as much an enemy to her as the spacers were. Albin wanted to press the issue, but felt the captain of the Frontier might have better luck. He paid the captain 2,500 credits for repairing the satellites, before promising them much more money if they would help the colonists with a bigger mission, coordinating the removal of the spacers from the system. At the heart of this plan was the organization of the Defense Pact. Each of the families had a couple ships and some battle-tested men and women at their disposal, but they couldn't take on the spacers alone. If they combined their forces, they'd have a real shot at victory. He asked the captain to speak with Chanda and Jacqueline and get them on board. Chanda thanked the captain for repairing his satellite and revealed that he was already ready to work together against the spacers. He wasn't Albin's biggest fan, and he wasn't sure that they would continue to cooperate in the long term, but for now the plan made sense. Jacqueline, on the other hand, hated Albin and didn't want anything to do with him now or in the future. She had the most ships and men as it was, and could likely hold out against the spacers long after the other families fell. She felt that in cooperating and attempting to evict the spacers, she had the most to lose. The captain worked to persuade her to join up by offering the salvage rights to the spacer ships. They reminded her that if the Banda and Lopez families were in league without her, they would likely grow more powerful than her over time. In the end, they managed to convince her that together they had the best chance of evicting the spacers. With that, she agreed to work with the Defense Pact, at least for the moment. Albin was amazed by the captain's work and revealed that he already had plans for the coming battle. He had detected 2 new squads of spacer ships in orbit above Tau Ceti 8. Though Albin offered to send the ships of the newly minted Pact to assist the Frontier, the captain told him to hold those ships in reserve, assuming that they would need that firepower in whatever battle was to come. With that, the Frontier departed Jacqueline Lemaire's ship and headed for the first of the 2 spacer squads. The spacers here were more numerous than before, and the Frontier was damaged in the fight. The crew made some quick fixes, and the captain set a course for the second group. With this second party of spacers taken out, the Frontier once again repaired the damage taken in the fight. With the 2 groups defeated, the captain returned to the Lopez farm. Upon touching down, the captain found the 3 heads of the families discussing the fight ahead. During that last fight, Albin had traced the spacers' communications back to their base of operations. It seems that the spacers had taken control of a derelict star station in orbit above Tau Ceti 8. The Defense Pact had their target. Albin asked the captain to say a few words to prepare their force for the upcoming fight. The captain urged the families to be cautious. They might be united now, but the Spacers were still a force to be reckoned with. With these words in mind, the Frontier once again rose into orbit above Tau Ceti 2A, on course to the Spacer Star Station. The Frontier and the Colonial Defense Fleet arrived together and set the Spacer defense ships in their crosshairs. After a spirited battle in which these Spacer ships were destroyed, a second squad of Spacers arrived. Once this second party of ships was similarly converted to slag, the Colonial ships docked with the station and their crews stormed aboard. After battling through the first ranks of the defenders alongside the forces of the Defense Pact, the captain of the Frontier ascended the elevator and brought the fight to the upper level of the station. Though the Spacers put up quite a fight, they were defeated in the end. With the battle over, the captain met the three family heads for a debrief. Albin Lopez thanked the captain for their help and paid them 5,000 credits for having conducted this second half of the battle to rid the system of Spacers. When asked about the future of the Defense Pact, Albin was hopeful, but he conceded that with everything they'd just gone through, they were in a honeymoon period, so anything was possible. Alright, I think that'll do it for the narrative of the Family Defense Pact, but before closing things out, I have some notes. First, let's get back to the mission location issue with which I started the video. When I had first entered the system, I'd not been recording, so for the purposes of making the video, I went back to record the introduction to the mission. I loaded up an old save and jumped to Tau Ceti, only this time around I couldn't find the colonists. I flew to Tau Ceti 2A thinking maybe I'd originally heard the call from the orbit of the moon on which the Lopez farm stood. With these searches turning up nothing, I decided to check online to see if there was something I was missing. There, I found a site claiming that the mission took place in the Eta Cassiopeia system. I assumed that maybe Bethesda had moved the mission with a patch, so I checked Eta Cassiopeia and once again found nothing. A dozen other systems of searching later, and I finally found myself receiving Albin Lopez's broadcast in the Andromos system. With that, I think I can say with some confidence that the location is randomized, though not completely. The system has to be large enough to support the 4 different colony sites. Regardless of this, I think that randomizing the location was a poor decision on Bethesda's part. Why? Because the random sites don't necessarily make any sense with the stories of the families. Take the Lopez family, for instance. They're supposed to be farmers and the first family into the system, meaning that they have prime choice on where to settle. In the version of the mission I experienced in the Tau Ceti system, the Lopez family settled Tau Ceti 2A, the barren, lifeless moon of Tau Ceti 2. Tau Ceti 2 is a planet with oceans of water and breathable air. It makes no sense to go for the moon of a livable planet with life already on it. This version also had the Banda satellite and presumably the Banda family colony set on or around Tau Ceti 9, the farthest planet from Tau Ceti and an ice giant. This is in no way ideal for a farming family. Along with this, there are numerous other outposts in the Tau Ceti system that aren't mentioned. Mines, farms, a meat processing plant on Tau Ceti 2, even a civilian outpost on Tau Ceti 1 that doesn't belong to the Lemaire family. Bethesda should have simply chosen a star system for this mission and set the locations accordingly. At the very least, they should have made stricter rules about where the colonies could spawn to make more sense with the given lore. Second, what's with all the unrealistic claims in Starfield? In my first Starfield lore video, I covered Captain Brackenridge wanting to claim the entirety of the planet Porama-2 for her people, believing that she couldn't share the world with a pleasure colony on the other side. Now we have Albin Lopez believing that his family had rights to the entire star system in which they settled. Why did he think his family got the entire system? It's a star system. There's no way he can try to claim the entire thing as his own. Third, the Lopez farm is ridiculous. It's a single room structure with a small fenced area. I have to assume that this is not intended to be representative of the full breadth of the Lopez family's property, as I can't see how this could be considered a farm, as they don't grow anything, and I can't see how they could have supported a couple ships and a group of fighters as they had in the final fight with the Spacers. Normally, I understand this choice in game design. Game worlds are limited in space, and if you fill everything with the logical amount of farmland that would be required for people to live, far more land would be farmland. Especially in games set in the medieval past, where something like 80 to 90% of the population worked in agriculture. But that's not the case in Starfield. We have over 1,000 planets worth of space. Not only should the Lopez farm be on a planet with an atmosphere, but it should also stretch across many acres, even if it's a hydroponic farm. Fourth, the narrative I shared is what I believe is the one with the best potential outcomes. There are a few small points where things can go differently, and I'll detail those here. A, probably the smallest change, you can repair the satellites belonging to the Banda, Wynn, and Lemaire families in whatever order you want. There is slightly different dialogue, but overall this doesn't change the outcome of the mission. B, the biggest change, you can fail to get the Lemaire's involved in the Defense Pact. There are 2 ways to convince Jacqueline Lemaire. A bribe or persuasion? When you attempt to bribe her with 2,000 credits, she responds that with all Albin has done to her family, she'll only accept 5 times that, 10,000 credits. If you don't want to pay that or don't manage to persuade her, you can proceed with just the Lopez and Band of Families. While this works, the space battles are harder as you have fewer allies, and in the end, Albin is far less positive about the future of the Pact. Strangely, the final reward here, regardless of the number of families in the Pact, is still 5,000 credits. One would assume that the more families involved, the larger the reward. See, you can choose to accept help taking down the ships before going after the station. I didn't notice any difference here. The ship count in the last battle was the same regardless of the choice. In terms of realism though, it made more sense to me to keep the colonial ships in reserve for the last battle. D, you can choose not to take a reward from the Defense Pact for assisting them in the last battle. As far as I can tell, there is no upside to this option other than the feeling that comes with being altruistic. Either way, the experience reward is the same, and I have yet to come across any post-mission encounters in which this has come up. Back to the rest of the notes. 5th, the Spacers managed to take out a Galbank transport in the time in which they controlled the system. The safes from that ship are still on board the Star Station and unopened. The key to the safe can be found in the captain's office next to a copy of Grunt Issue 8. I found over 20,000 credits in these safes myself. Strangely, the normally very strictly moral Sarah Morgan doesn't seem to mind if we take these stolen credits for ourselves. Lastly, I have to wonder why the families didn't maintain the station. They could have used it as a system-wide depot for shipments in and out of the system, a place to park their defensive ships, a place to host a system-wide council. It feels like a missed opportunity. Upon returning to the system, I found the station absent. Anyway, I think that'll do it for this video. Follow me on X for lore video announcements at Gaming with Maps. My Discord is open to the public. There's a link in the channel's banner. I stream every Friday evening on YouTube. Come check it out if you're interested. If you appreciate what I do here and you want to support the channel financially, you can become a member on YouTube or a patron with Patreon. I want to thank my patrons Mesothelioma, 76 at Texas, Dark Malcontent, Real76, Dr. Orion, Samsung Smart Fridge, Night Spearhead, and Ahotep for their support. This has been the Irresolute Cartographer. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again next time.